So let's say you're a photography noob. Maybe you just got your first DSLR, or maybe you've had one for a little bit now and you want to learn how to get out of auto mode and you want to learn how to shoot manual. You want to get more comfortable with your camera and figure out what each thing does and how to use it in certain situations. So today guys, I'm going to go right into that. I'm going to tell you guys how to shoot manual photography. How to use your ISO, how to use your aperture, how to use shutter speed. So let's go ahead and roll that intro. So as I said, there's a few things that go into manual photography, things like shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. The first one that I want to start with is shutter speed. So how a shutter works is basically when you press your button, it's going to expose your sensor for a certain amount of time. Now when you have it somewhere around 1/50th of a second, it's going to be open longer, it's going to expose your sensor more, and it's also going to allow more motion blur if something's moving in your shot. Now say you move to somewhere around 1/200th of a second. That's going to cut a lot more light out of your shot, and there's going to be no motion blur because your sensor was not exposed for very long. Now let's show an example of a high shutter speed versus a low shutter speed. The low shutter speed has more motion blur, and the high shutter speed has less motion blur because the sensor was exposed for less time. So that's going to lead us into ISO. Now think of ISO as like a volume dial for how sensitive your sensor is to light. So say we've got our shutter speed where we want it, but it's still underexposed. What we can do is crank our ISO up and it's going to make our image properly exposed. Now there's a little bit of a downside to high ISOs. Think of it as, we said volume, right? If you turn your volume up too loud, it gets peaking, it's crackly, and it sounds awful. So let's kind of transfer that over to photography, to an image. When you set your ISO too high, it's going to get grainy and you're going to lose quality, and we don't really want that. So a term you guys might have heard when looking into cameras or buying cameras is low light performance or low light capabilities. Now the Sony a7S II, the camera that I shot these photos with, has really good low light performance. You can crank that thing up to 20,000 ISO and still have usable photos for the most part. Now, for a lot of other cameras, if you try to go anywhere above 6400 ISO, you're really pushing it, and how usable your photo is. So depending on what kind of photography you guys are doing, you might want to research what cameras do better in different situations for ISO. Like me personally, I shoot astrophotography a lot, so having a camera like an a7S II, where I can just crank it up to 20,000 ISO and get the Milky Way super easily, that's really important for me. But for somebody who's not really doing astrophotography, you might just want a camera that has, average ISO capabilities. So that leads us into aperture. Now, when you go from a dark room to a bright room, your pupil closes, and that's kind of the same idea when you're looking at aperture in a lens. Now, when we're open at f2, it's going to let a lot of light in, but as I close this, I stop it down, it's going to dilate, kind of like your pupil, to the size of a pinhole. So the same thing goes for a lens, guys. When you're at a lower f-stop, you're going to let a lot more light in than when you're at a higher f-stop. And keep in mind, when you're at a lower f-stop, it's going to get some nice depth of field behind you compared to when you're at a higher f-stop. Now, I could stand here and go over the technicalities with you guys all day like anybody else who's made a tutorial about this, but I think it's important that you guys see some real-life scenarios and real-life situations where these settings will intertwine with each other and you're going to have to figure out, what to compensate with or what to raise, what to lower. So that's going to lead us into scenario 1, guys. So say we're outside, we want to shoot a portrait, but it's getting kind of dark and we didn't bring our tripod. So a general rule of thumb for portraits is that you want your subject to be well exposed, you want your background to be blurred out so they stand out. So what we're going to do is we're going to set our shutter speed to somewhere around 1/50th because we want to have that nice exposure without having to bump our ISO too much. And at the same time, we want to compensate because we don't have a tripod, so we don't want our shot to be shaky. So I'm going to take a test photo. I'm just going to see what we're working with here, and it looks a little bit underexposed to me right now. So that's where ISO is going to come in. We're just going to turn that little volume dial up on our sensitivity, and it's going to expose our image properly. Now showing a comparison, the second one looks a lot better. So that leads us into scenario 2. So say you got a buddy who's got a sweet car and he wants you to shoot photos for him. Now, you don't want his car to look slow, right? So you want to have some motion blur in there. You want to make it look like his car is moving as he drives by you. So what we're going to do is we're going to set our shutter speed to somewhere around maybe 1/10th, 1/15th, somewhere in there, just so there's some nice motion blur. We're going to take a test shot here, and look, it's super blown out because it's bright outside, there's sun. So to compensate for that, we're just going to close down our aperture, guys, so less light comes through our lens. Now, our buddy isn't too happy with it, right? We're happy with the exposure, but he says, I wish there was more depth behind me. Now, there's a little tool you guys can get called a variable ND filter, and what this allows you to do is you can stop down your lens more so there's more motion blur in the back, basically a lower f-stop. If you guys want to learn more about a variable ND filter, I've got a video coming out soon where I go kind of in depth on them, so be sure to subscribe if you guys want to see that. So let's just jump right into scenario 3, guys. Now, have you ever seen those super cool light trails on the freeway when people shoot like LA or New York City, and you got those really nice light streaks? I'm going to show you guys how to accomplish that. So it's pretty close to scenario 2 how we do this. So we're just going to go out, we're going to set our shutter speed to maybe like 5 seconds just so we get a lot of nice light trailing. And we're going to take a test photo, just see what we're working with here. We're at f2. And it still looks a little bit underexposed. So the same as before, guys, the same as the other scenario, we're just gonna crank up our volume on our ISO. We're gonna raise it up so that way our photo is more exposed. And that's pretty much it. Now, don't be afraid, guys, to go shoot a bunch of photos when you're doing this sort of thing. Feel free to experiment and just understand how your camera's working. That's how you're gonna learn. You're gonna learn a lot more from personal experience and going out and shooting than I can ever teach you just talking to the camera. Come on, guys, we live in the digital age. It's not like we're shooting on film anymore, so if you got an 8GB SD card, that's gonna give you a couple hundred photos to work with. So that pretty much sums it up, guys. Feel free to send your photos to me on Twitter, guys. I really want to see what you guys are working on. I want to see how you guys are, playing around with your camera, your learning experiences. Send them to me on Twitter, send them to me on Instagram. You guys can find my social media links down below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making it. I like photography, I have a passion for it, and it's fun to teach it to people. So that's pretty much gonna wrap it up. I will catch you guys next time. Bye!